Thank you all. Thank you, Kenneth. Hello, Copenhagen. I'm really excited to be here. I've heard such wonderful things, mainly from Kenneth, about this event the last few years, but I wasn't able to attend before, and so it's really nice to be a part of it this year. Today's been very exciting. The talks have been excellent. I'm glad everyone's had a bit of a drink and some sugar, because we're about to talk about CSS. And I think drinking is the way you get through CSS. So that's good. I'm glad the schedule worked out for that. My name is Glenn. Glenn Maddern on Twitter if you want to say hello. Then please do. I'm from Australia, which is a long way away, but I've been in Copenhagen for a few days now. Notice that there's actually quite a lot of other Australians here, as there tends to be in places in Europe, so I apologize for them. I'll try to make sure no others come, because, yeah, we're pretty awful. The accent is hard. Anyway, a bit about me. I have spent the last few years being a freelancer, front-end engineer, I suppose you would call it, UI engineer, front-end web developer. It's strange, we don't really seem to have a very good term for what we all do. I mean, front-end is pretty comprehensive, but my background is in the back-end and bigger distributed systems. I used to do C++ and Java, and only recently have I moved across to the front end. So I have no design background, which I feel the keen lack of sometimes. But recently I stopped being a freelancer, and I started a new project called Front End Center, which is a screencast series, which you might be interested in. But I'm not going to talk about it except to say that I'm clearly not a designer, because I found one font that I like, and I use it for everything. So if I publish anything in the next couple of years, it's going to look exactly the same. But I like it, and finally found one. But both freelancing and doing screencast stuff is all a clever ploy to think deeply about problems in CSS and in front end generally. I find it really interesting to know, like, things change so quickly, but they sort of follow a certain pattern, and it's interesting to start to see where there might be areas where you could contribute something, which I've been lucky to do in the last couple of years. So last year, as Kenneth sort of hinted at, I started thinking about this question about CSS in particular, and what about it makes it so hard to maintain, like really hard to maintain. Because when I started doing CSS, I was very bad at it, and it seems like everybody, when they start doing CSS, everyone makes the same sort of mistakes. But CSS is unusual, because when you're doing another programming language, when it gets bad, it doesn't get quite as bad as when CSS gets bad. Because CSS doesn't just get bad, it gets possessed. It gets actively malevolent. It gets hard to live with. Basically, you write code, and you look at it, and it stares back at you, and it looks like this. Right? No other programming languages end up looking like this. And so I was thinking about what about CSS, what aspects of CSS get bad. What I call like the stages of demonic CSS. The first is when you start to use complicated selectors. So complicated selectors when you're using nesting or tag selectors, lots of pseudo selectors, knots, lots of, mainly nesting is the big one, I suppose. That's kind of a bad sign. But most people don't know any better. And I kind of, like, my metaphor for that is if you've got a room, if your CSS is in your nice little room, then complicated selectors are like just being a bit messy, leaving some stuff on the ground when you shouldn't. It's not too bad, but it's the start of worse things. The second kind of symptom is when you have to override things. When you start a new component, you have to back out all these assumptions that you made earlier, right? That to me is if in the room metaphor, which I'm going to extend as far as I can, is that like if you pick something up, it's covered in a fine layer of dust, and you have to brush it off every time, and you're like, this is kind of gross. The whole place is just kind of a bit gross. And then you start to get into the very CSS-specific problems, which is, say you're working on a piece of CSS code, and then you check a page that you haven't been touching for weeks, and it's completely broken, and you have no idea why. I call this like living with a poltergeist, where you're sitting at some part of the room, and then a plate flies off the wall and smashes against the window, and you're like, I definitely didn't do that. There's something else here, right? So this is the sort of thing that CSS does that other languages don't seem to. And then there's bang important, right? I mean, I've used bang important. There's cases where it doesn't work unless you do, and so you do, and then it does. But that's the same as like finding an ancient scroll in a cemetery written in Latin and just reading it out and then being surprised that the dead have risen and they're running at you, right? Bang important is like a summoning charm. You shouldn't use it. But my favorite thing about when CSS gets bad is when you just give up. You're just like, oh, all right, the demons live here now. The only thing I will safely do is open the door and throw in a little piece of code and then close it again and run away, right? Nobody has the confidence to even scroll up from the bottom of the file, right? That's the CSS that I know from experience. And everybody, like the amount of time you spent with CSS, the more of these things you've encountered. So last year I was thinking about this problem, and thinking about what it is that, that we all share and what could we do to fix it. So I was involved in a project called CSS Modules, helped to start it, wrote the blog post that got it the most attention right at the beginning. And it's basically designed to do that. I'm not going to talk too much about it, except to say that it follows a pattern that I've seen play out in front-end a fair bit, and probably happens in other industries as well, but I don't really care. The first step is that somebody comes up with an idea. Somebody comes up, maybe it's somebody's throwaway comment at a conference talk, maybe it's written in a blog post, maybe it just emerges from the community, nobody knows who the first person to think of it was. But the idea has some merit and it starts to take hold. Then from that, a technique is developed. People write about the idea, they kind of formalize it. People try it out and then they write about how it went. And it gets more and more kind of structured. And then somebody comes along and automates it. Puts it either into a tool, like CSS Modules is, really, or it makes its way into the browser, the platform, the protocol, whatever. And then once you've done that, you now no longer have to spend this effort to think about this technique that you've been following before. Now you're freed up to think about new ideas. So in CSS Modules, the idea is that the demons are getting in because we're using these complicated selectors. We're using tags that apply to, tag selectors that apply to stuff all over the page. We're using multiple classes on a single element, so you could change a class, not realize it's being used somewhere, and then in some circumstances or in some page, something's now broken. Or, hello? Yeah? Or nesting, where you're increasing specificity and you can't decrease it. So you always have to keep escalating, and then you end up with bang important. And the idea is just to get rid of all of it. Just use class names. Just a single class name. Use at one point in the code base. And a lot of these problems go away. Then the technique from that is Ben. Instead of having just random class names, here's a way of generating them. And you do, and you come up with, it's quite easy to understand the name that you have to use in any given situation. It feels similar to nesting in some ways, but it doesn't have the same implications. And that's what CSS Modules kind of is. It is a technology to kind of, well, it started as technology to automate that process, to be automatic about the class names that are actually sent to the browser, so you can just use these short names and you don't have to worry about it. And then once you stop worrying about it, you have all these extra cycles in your head to spend on the hard problems, right? Which is why I think it's been successful, because it frees people up. So I like that. I think that was good. But that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about CSS Modules. Because I started thinking about a new problem, because I like to do this, because I freelance so I have time off so I can do this because I'm a terrible nerd. My question this year has been, why is it so hard to reuse CSS? Why don't we have a really nice ecosystem of all these components, these UI elements that you can just grab? And like, for me, freelancing, working with a team, starting a new project, I tell them every time to start from scratch. Don't start with a framework. And yet, in other languages, you don't do that. It's much easier to run someone else's code than it is to write your own, which is how we get problems like left pad. But in general, the concept is good. And I think the key thing is that a computer doesn't care. Whatever you pull across, it doesn't care. It could be written in a different style. It could be written in a different language and then compiled to JavaScript, or like run as a C extension. The computer just runs it. Just switches from your context to its context and jumps back. So there's virtually no penalty to running other people's code, which means when you start a project, you start with other people's code. But that doesn't really work with UI, because you have humans, and humans are awful. Like, I spent the big chunk of my career trying to avoid humans at all costs, right? And I think most back-end developers kind of do that. Front-end, you have to embrace the user. You have to consider design and UX as being on par with any engineering kind of decision. And when you're trying to use someone else's code or someone else's components, you have a user who can see right through it instantly, without any effort at all. They can see if it's consistent or not. So here's an example from the Semantic UI website. There's a nice framework, actually. I'll use it for a few examples, because it's quite good. They have different themes, and so this, I think, is their default theme. But if you replace one of the components with one of the different themes, I think this might be Amazon theme, then it looks broken straight away. You can spot the odd one out. And the differences are tiny. They're all in the details. There's a border, there's a slight gradient, there's an inversion of color for the icon, which doesn't happen on the other buttons. And if you take two and you break it, now it doesn't even look like a whole row. Like, it just doesn't look consistent. And so the penalty for getting it wrong, even by a couple of pixels, is huge. Now, some UIs, they can be broken and they can still work. If you've used an internet banking software, you probably have experienced this, which is your money is in there and you will walk through fire to get it. But I think we all want to do better than that. And the other problem is if you just grab something off the shelf. I mean, the product that you're building is probably not that different. The website that you're presenting is probably not that different to your competitors or the other things that people would have seen that day. And so if you go all in with somebody else's UI, then you run the risk of looking far too samey. And so, and this is a great example, because this is basically every website built in the last several years, just, the details changed. So you're stuffed either way. So the current as far as I can tell, the current best practice for shipping reusable UI components is to also ship a giant settings file using Sass or something. And what you've done then is you take all those tiny little decisions about each individual UI thing and you front load it, because Sass, you set these settings and then it generates CSS. So if you want to change anything, you have to bring it all the way to the front and rerun. And so you can't miss anything. You have to be comprehensive. And I've got a little example of Bootstrap's variables file, which is a Sass file with a table of contents. So you're in for a nice long read. And it just keeps going. There's just so much. There's just tons of everything. Actually, I've got a picture of it printed out. The Bootstrap settings file. Actually, that is not the Bootstrap settings file. That is the Apollo lunar lander code that Margaret Hamilton wrote by hand, assembly code to put people on the moon and then bring them back safely, which really puts CSS into perspective, I think. I like to look at this whenever I have a real problem and I realize how petty CSS problems are. But I think if someone can write code to safely transport humans to the moon, then I could probably figure out my CSS problem. So I like to think of it in a positive way, but the negative way also works. Semantic UI, on their homepage, they have this badge saying that they have 3,000 theming variables, and they're very proud of it, and it's very comprehensive, and good on them. Except that's terrifying, because 3,000 of anything in a software project is terrifying. But it's all they have. And so it's good that they did. And so what I wanted to do, and I wanted to come up here and talk about, is that, hey, I've figured out some great new technology that's going to automate all this stuff, and it's going to make all these problems go away. Piggyback on the best practices that are already out there, much in the way that CSS Modules sort of did. Except, I think that's what's happened. I don't think that's where we are in the cycle. I think what's happened, or what's happening now, is that the technology is changing. We need new ideas and techniques to keep up with them. And the biggest thing that I think is shifting is the presence of the CSS Variables specification, which to me is going to be as big a change to our workflow as any other thing that in my few years working on the front end I've seen it. Just an aside, the spec is called custom properties. Everyone calls them variables. I call them variables. I don't really care for the spec. I just call them variables. I like that. Here's the problem. We have almost 2/3 of the internet going public at the moment who are running browsers that support them. That number has gone up by about 20% in the last few months because iOS 9.3 came out and Safari 9.1 came out. They're the latest to offer this. But Opera, Chrome, and Firefox have had it for a while. Edge still hasn't implemented it. If you know anybody who works for Microsoft, just tap them on the shoulder and say, we could really do with this. But the problem is, even once Edge supports it, it can't be polyfilled in any meaningful way. So if you have users that you care about using any of these other browsers, then you can't really use this stuff yet, which is why it's been almost there for several years now. I think it was proposed in 2011. But it's still not had that kind of critical mass for people to take it and to develop the next way of doing CSS. So that's pretty much what I'm talking about today. What do we do once this lands? So I have a name. I'm going to coin a name, and it's incredibly bland, so I don't actually get to coin it. But I'm going to call this idea responsive components. Because responsive design had a pretty profound change on the way we work. And I think what is possible now, or is about to be possible, is the idea that we take that responsivity, and we take that kind of approach to reuse, and we apply it to even the lowest level components. Because in my mind, responsive design was about the death of this idea that you could ever implement a design to pixel perfection. Somebody could give you a design and you could just implement it. Because you recognized, I mean, obviously that was never true because the content would change and so your design would have to adapt. But you recognize the idea that what gets drawn on the screen is a function of what you've built and a function of the screen. The size of the screen, the capabilities of the device. Those are the two things that go into the result. And yet, I'm guilty of this, and I see other people being guilty of this. When we move to doing component-based design and move to things like React, we almost thought we got it back. You know, you said that the overall layout is perfectly fluid and beautiful, but each component I finally have control over, each component again. And I think we need to let that die, that idea die as well. I think for components to be reusable in a way that passes a human's kind of filter, that looks as good as building it yourself, your components need to demand less and respond more. And I'll sort of go into that a little bit. But basically, I'm saying that if you needed to customize something, then the customization needs to be inherent to the component. It should respond to its environment for every aspect of it, rather than expecting the environment to override the component, either by using CSS selectors that reach into it, or by grabbing that settings file, changing all the variables, and then rebuilding. But before I kind of get to that contextual stuff, I want to talk about layout, because I think layout is a big culprit of why we build, particularly within systems, not even sharing it among peers, but why components aren't as reusable. I think layout is a huge culprit. Because I used to use a grid system, which is a set of layout components that let you lay things out, and then each element just fills its space. But then again, once I moved to using components, I stopped using that. With Flexbox, it's too easy to have individual elements also lay themselves out, setting margins, setting padding, that sort of thing. I mean, if you look at the box model, you've got all of these things you can tweak. You can change the margin. You can say that this element pushes things away. You can change the padding, and you can change the intrinsic size of the element, whether it tries to fill a certain space or collapses onto its content. And I think the way to build responsive components, the way to build reusable components, is to only set padding, and that layout becomes a separate class of components. And this I've actually started doing in the last 6 or so months, and it's paid off huge. I want to kind of like bring it into this talk because I think people should be doing it. Basically, a component shouldn't set its width, it shouldn't set its margin, it shouldn't set its flex behavior. That should all be the responsibility of something else. Component should just respond. It should just work with what it's got. And you can do that with things like Flexbox. You can say that a parent element lays out its children in a certain way. So this parent element is in control of the layout of its children, but the children don't care. They don't care what order they're in. They don't care how big they are. they just respond. And if you need margin in between the elements, then the best place to put it is with the parent. The parent sets the padding and the margin, and they're both 1 rem, so they're always going to be consistent. If you haven't seen the selector, the star plus star, it's called the lobotomized owl, and it's useful anytime you have a series of children. It's basically the same as not first child, but I really like the owl. And it probably performs worse, but they perform so well that I prefer it. Any kind of joy you can find in your work, particularly with CSS, you should take it. So you can specify these things, and actually I kind of think that layout is the one thing you don't reuse. There are some general purpose layouts, but generally, things like margin, things like layout, things like size, how things wrap, they're specific to the context of the site or the goals of the design. So potentially you have something where the first thing has to be half the screen, and then you might have multiple things on the right-hand side, and they all just need to fill themselves out. If we set width 50% on 1, on this component called 1 here, and then we needed to use it somewhere else, we would have to back that out. We'd have to make 2 variants of it, one that sets its width, one that doesn't. Whereas here we can just, it can just figure itself out. But that brings me to the kind of bigger thing, and I think the thing that's really changed, because all of that stuff is available now. Oh, out of interest, these kind of setting properties on a parent component that override, that determine the layout of their children is the way the grid spec works. Properties like flex grow and the space between elements, they are actually part of the parent selector now for the grid spec, which kind of shows that that's part of the parent's concern. But the thing that's changed, or about to change, is the idea of using context in a much stronger way. Now, we have been doing this. Like I've used this sometimes, using something that's been in CSS for a long time and got a proper name in CSS3 called current color. So here I have a little example of a card. And if you click this, it gets darker. And if you click this, it shows a party emoji. And it's all very boring because I designed it myself. Except if you change the color, then everything changes. The background has a gradient, but now it's a dark red gradient. This thing now goes dark red, and this thing changes color as well. Even the box shadow is different. And it's all driven from, effectively, a CSS variable. It just happens to be color. And this can work. We get green. We get a Peru. I like Peru. Papaya whip doesn't look any good. It's a shame. Let's get purple. Oh, beautiful. And the way this is working is that I have this background current color, which takes the computed value of current color at that point in the tree and draws itself. This is on the before element that overlays, that then gets drawn and changes opacity on click. And so if I jump to, say, this div here, and I say color green, then I've changed the kind of contextual color down the hierarchy. But this link didn't change. I didn't have to build multiple versions of it, and I didn't have to care whether these colors were permitted within the design system. I just built something that would always work with the color that's been set. The reason that the text doesn't show as colored is because I'm overriding it for the text, and that nothing inherits from those text elements. If I change this, then everything becomes the color. And that's the limitation of this, because you only have one color to inherit down the tree. But it's possible now, and if you have a piece of UI that only needs one color, then you should use current color, because then suddenly it's completely customizable, it's completely responsive. There's a talk, how I learned about it was a talk from a conference that I helped to run in Australia, CSS Conf AU, by Simurai, who talks about using current color Ms and Rems to build these flexible components, which is really, really good if you're looking at doing this stuff right now. But the point is the browser's about to change. So this is the default, this is the simplest possible CSS Variables demo. Most people see this and then they don't get what the big deal is. I admit I was in that camp, because it looks just like a Sass variable. You set something and you use it. And you can calculate stuff, but it seems like too many characters. But apart from that, it looks the same. I think the big difference is when you are designing a component and you're using something that doesn't exist, or that you haven't defined, something like spacing. because now you've been explicit about, hey, I'm looking for something. And if you don't provide it, I'll just go with toRem, but if you provide it, I'll use it. This is an explicit hook for this thing to be themed. So if you have a container and you set this variable, that when you use the component, it just renders. It renders at the exact right size. It renders still on the right aspect ratio because that's intrinsic to the component, but it's driven off a variable that happened to be there on the page. And passing information down in this way, down the tree, I think is the way that you'll be able to take these components and not have to anticipate every possible use case. They just work. Drop them and they work. Now, you may have also seen this, the idea that you can override these variables by adding extra classes, and the normal cascade rules apply. So if you change spacing or size on the component itself, then everything gets recalculated. So you can change it on hover, you can do whatever you like. But this is going back to demonic CSS for me, because when you have multiple things all acting on a component, and it's just the order of which, or the specificity of which, wins out, then that, I think, leads to confusion. Whereas passing things down the tree makes more sense, and I'll come back to that point. What I think you should think about these components as being, when you use a variable that you don't define, you're effectively making a component factory. You're saying, you give me a background color and a foreground color, and I'll generate you and your component. But it's all done with CSS. You don't have to use React. You don't have to pollute the interface that you were using for whatever other kind of component stuff that you're passing down. This is pure style, which is what CSS is good at. So I've got a demo of that because it's kind of an extension of the one before. You can tell I'm not a designer, by the way, because all I know about design is that you should put lots of call to action buttons and big, thin text. Also converts really well, that's all I know. Here I have a few buttons, right? And they invert when you hover them. So this one has a thin border, and it goes white when you hover, red otherwise. This is thick, goes black. This is inverted again. And these are all driven from variables, so they're contextual. So if I change foreground to light green here, then we've changed the design of that section. The text and the button have gone together. And if we change the background, we're driving multiple things off the same variable, right? And that's all well and good, but that's basically like the current color demo, but just with two colors now, except that turns out to be a really powerful idea. Because the really cool thing about this is that this button itself uses these variables, defines some variables itself, but it's so contextual that if I grab it from here and I drag it into a different part of the DOM, then it looks perfect. It looks exactly the way it would if you'd made a variation of it. Same thing up here. These are interchangeable. I don't think I've ever built a website where I could drag elements around the DOM and have them lay themselves out perfectly. Maybe other people hit that kind of goal more often, but for me, this is really cool. Because now my button will always work. If I'm building it for somebody who's got the design decisions, I can say, hey, it's built. You just set the variables, and we'll work with it, and we'll figure out what looks best in that context. So it brings me back to this idea of the inheritance versus cascade, because I said before that CSS gets evil in certain ways. And it does. And I think the cascade is responsible for huge sources of errors. It's also the reason it's successful at all, so it's not all bad. But CSS Modules is almost designed to defeat the cascade. To be just a single class and an element means you don't have multiple classes all trying to contribute styles. And so it almost seems a bit strange for me to be up here and be talking about using context so liberally, when the whole point was to get away from global action, global consequences. But inheritance doesn't work like the cascade, because there's only one parent. So if you're inheriting something, you know where to look. There is only one way up the tree. And so you don't have the same level of complexity of problems by using it. You can defer all this information to its context without introducing all these problems. And you already use inheritance all the time. Every time you use position relative and position absolute, that is making a connection between two elements that happen to be nested to say that this thing depends on that for positioning. And this is doing the same thing, but for all kinds of visual traits. So I can kind of see a future where the new Bootstrap is a series of these components, and they all have a naming convention like FG and BG. But then you come along and somebody else makes a beautiful component that you want to use, and it uses foreground and background because that person likes to type more than they need to. But because these things are dynamic, then there's no problem. In my case from before, I have spacing. I'm looking for spacing. My component wants the word spacing, and let's say I can't change it. And in my container, I have the word grid size, and let's say I can't change it. Then I can attach a class that relates those two, and I can do it on the container, I can do it on the component, it can be anywhere in between, and it will all just work. And this is great, because the browser is just doing all this work for you. And that with a single class, you could map any popular framework to any other popular framework, because if there's an equivalence in the variables that they're looking for. Which I think makes this really useful. But if you're going to get really implicit about what you're expecting and have all of these crazy effects that are happening based on context, I think you also need to be quite explicit about what you're asking for. You look at a modern class-based CSS framework like Semantic, it has, actually I'll just show you on the website, it has buttons. It has lots of buttons. It has huge numbers of buttons. But it documents them all, which is why I like this so much, because while I think it's like, it's way more, like there's so much more in it than anything I've ever built to be reused, the level of documentation, the level of polish is excellent. And the problem for me is that I don't know how many of these classes work with other classes because they're all just classes. So I need to go and find the particular variable, the particular class names and try them out or look for an example here along the page somewhere. And I think that we can do better than that. If you look at something like a React example, this is Rebase, it adds styling information as an explicit parameter on the UI. So you can pass in colors, you can pass in background colors, you can pass whether it's rounded or not. But you can also pass a href, which is a functional change. And to me, this is kind of mixing and matching both style and function needs a separation. It's missing a level of separation. So I had a little go at what if I was to publish components like this, what they might look like. And it's the button from before. And I've got these 3 examples of it. Or 4, actually. And then here, the information, I've just done this by hand, but if this technique makes sense, then this is the sort of thing you can automate. You can look at the declaration of the component, look at all the variables that are used, generate this documentation straight away. But the other cool thing is that these can be dynamic as well. Right? So if you think of these things as being responsive components, then playing around with different variables is the equivalent of resizing your browser for a responsive design project. I mean, you may not have any users that look at exactly 699 pixels or whatever you currently have your browser at, and you may never ship a button this big or this ugly to your customers. But it is useful to explore the bounds of the system that you've designed, to change variables, see how that looks, see if it's crap, see if it's good. And then you know if it's a resilient design element that then you can just throw into any context and it'll just work. And this is all just using, I mean, this is hacked up in very little time because these elements are all dynamic, and so these elements are just style elements that are using content editable. But you could conceivably generate something with sliders, all kinds of stuff where you can really test what you've built and know that you built it well. So the last level of aspects to this kind of responsive component idea is the idea that if you're going to make something that's truly reusable, then at some point somebody's going to use it in a way that you didn't anticipate, and you probably don't want to support, you just don't care. But somebody wants to use your code in a certain way. And so I can kind of see the value of having like a last line of defense, which is the component becomes open for modification. In React world with CSS modules, it would look something like this, where you have your React component and it takes three. The blue things here are your public API. You're asking for a title, image, and text to build up your media object. You import the CSS from a CSS file using CSS modules where you're asking it for these class names. You're asking for outer, image, inner, h1, and p. So you have these two APIs, one that's exposed and every consumer is going to have to worry about, and then the one that's internal that you want to enable people to override in case they need to. And the amount of change to do something like that is very small, because if you could pass in a theme object and that everything that previously was looking at the CSS that I've provided just gets intercepted and rewritten. And suddenly, the markup, the behavior, whatever the reason this person used this piece of UI is there, but all of the CSS is up for grabs. This isn't good enough by itself for something to be better than writing it from scratch, because the amount that you get versus the amount that you have to provide yourself. So that's why I think CSS Variables really unlocks that kind of ability to be like, set a few variables, tweak everything, get everything working, different components, different parts of the site, everything looks fine. But this is a nice fallback. And the same thing could apply with web components. It's just the idea that at some point you just give up and you say, oh, just give me your own styles. And again, that sort of thing can be automatically generated using static analysis or anything. So you could have title, image, and text that are all just read out of the function, signature, the CSS variables you have that could be dynamically changed, and then the record of what the internal structure is. And this gives whatever the consumer needs, whatever they, basically gives them whatever they want. And so while I wanted to talk about how I fixed the problem, and there's this new tool that you can just npm install and everything goes great, I don't think we're there yet. So for the moment, I think we still need to toss around ideas. And it's a bad idea to make predictions, but I do kind of think that 2016 is going to be the last year that we don't have a good solution here. Because once enough projects can use CSS variables, huge amounts are opened up in a way that I think people just haven't anticipated yet. So in summary, the things I think are going to be a part of whatever solution that ends up being is that layout isn't as reusable as other things, and so you should keep it separate from your UI. You should respond to context for everything, every small decision. You should be building these reactive contextual components that lay themselves out in the best possible way. You need to document stuff much more aggressively if you're going to be this implicit. And then finally, you just have to have an escape hatch when it all fails, and you just need to not have to, the equivalent is just forking the project. You want one more layer before that happens. And I think together that might be what the future of reusable CSS is, which was my talk. So thank you.